So since we have a bit more time, I think I can start off just with a bit of an introduction as to my approach for this paper. I'm a historian of the pre-war period generally, and before that I did a lot of research on the Holocaust, and still I think this question has come up a number of times throughout the conference, which is, how do we reconcile Jewish history and Holocaust history? I think this is still a question that historians have tried to contend with and will continue to contend with for many years to come. But I wanted to use some of the perspectives that I've gathered in my research on the pre-war years to incorporate those into at least my understanding of the Holocaust. So I'll begin. During his opening remarks at the third Yad Vashem International Historical Conference in 1977, Ezra Mendelsohn concluded with a question. Quote, to what extent did the pre-war situation influence the behavior of the Jewish leadership and the relationship between leaders and their constituencies during the Holocaust, end quote. Despite the passage of time and the growth of the field of Holocaust studies, Jewish historiography has not yet dealt adequately with the fundamental question of how the Jewish experience in the late 19th and early 20th centuries shaped responses to the Holocaust, especially during the first 3 years of the war. This paper is an initial investigation into this very specific absence in existing Holocaust historiography. Through a rereading of sources and new avenues of analysis, it's possible to draw out the ways in which we can see a reflection of the early 20th century history of Jewish society and politics in the responses to Nazi persecution. I'll use the case of Poland here, as the Jewish population in this country suffered the fullest extent of both Nazi and Soviet victimization. The more than 3 million Jews also produced a huge array of materials from which to study Jewish responses to the Holocaust. In the Polish case, historical sources show how factors like pre-war political activism and class distinction caused great difficulty in ghetto life, as we saw today at the Ghetto Fighters Museum, where status, financial standing, and political authority continued to shape the nature of daily life, of daily existence, even after the beginning of the liquidation of the ghettos in 1942. While these aspects of ghetto life have been studied to a large extent, other factors like ghetto criminality, smuggling, and care of the dead have received far less attention. In the areas of Poland that were occupied by the Soviet Union, pre-war factors were just as critical in deciding how Jews confronted Bolshevik and Red Army policy. After the start of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the Einsatzgruppen, particularly groups B and C, completely destroyed those communities that had already suffered near annihilation in the pogroms of 1918 to 1920. The question of how to reconcile Holocaust and Jewish history, or to use Sandra Gilman's words, how to, quote, place the Holocaust of 1933 to 1945 into, or remove it from, the continuity of the Jewish past, end quote, is still one of the most fundamental questions confronting scholars of the Jewish experience. The question also becomes more critical as the Holocaust increasingly functions as a source of justification or as a moral compass for contemporary Jewish ideology and identity. Even more, answering this question restores an element of the selfhood of those Jewish victims of Nazi genocide, devoid of the trappings of victimhood that obscure pre-war life and identity. Thus, the scholarship at the intersection of Jewish and Holocaust history calls for a phenomenological analysis of Jewish lived experience. To bridge the understanding of what are treated as distinct and almost unlinkable epochs, it's necessary to consider the subjective narrative and the evidence culled from subjective experience. Even in unprecedented times, individual Jews aim to make sense of their fate through not only past instances of persecution, as they had done during past anti-Jewish violence, but also through a range of political, social, and cultural responses based primarily on pre-war paradigms. The Holocaust was the most comprehensive action ever taken against the Jews, but even in this genocide, it still behooves scholars to further investigate the progression of response as a reflection of early 20th century experiences. In the remainder of my paper, I will focus on the existing body of historiography, and then using two thematic arenas, propose alternative means of analysis to understand Jewish responses to and the experiential aspects of the Holocaust. I want to first discuss how existing historiography has treated our understanding of the manner in which precedents have shaped Jewish responses to Nazi genocide. My first means of analysis considers continuities in political activities, specifically the manner in which movements across the political and religious spectrum used pre-war modes of organization to formulate a response to occupation and ghettoization. Finally, I will use the issue of corruption in the ghettos of Poland, a factor which, although exponentially greater during the war, was based on interwar practices and systems of organization. As this is a conference on Heinrich Graetz, it's important to begin with his perspective and influence on the historiography of the Holocaust. Graetz's monumental history of the Jews is, as we know and we've discussed, marked by its classic lachrymose view. His text shows numerous examples of how external persecution did much to shape the presentation of all elements of Jewish history. First-generation historians of the Holocaust have also used this approach to explain how victims of the Holocaust were guided by their knowledge of 2,000 years of Jewish history. Raoul Hilberg has forcefully contended that, quote, if we look at the whole Jewish reaction pattern, we notice that in its two salient features, it is an attempt to avert action, and failing that, automatic compliance with orders. Why did the Jews act in this way? They hoped that somehow the German drive would spend itself. This hope was founded on 2,000-year-old experience. In exile, the Jews had learned that they could avert danger and survive destruction by placating and appeasing their enemies, end quote. Dan Michman also has written that pre-war attitudes only serve to foster a wait-and-see approach. Such statements obscure those actions taken by Jews committed to remaining in Europe. In the Polish case, historians too often minimize the high level of Jewish mobilization in Poland's army. Even if this campaign was doomed, it's important to note that roughly 150,000 Polish Jews saw combat in September 1939 out of a total of 800,000 soldiers who enlisted to defend Poland. The most commonly used primary sources for the study of the Holocaust, diaries, memoirs, and Yiskerbücher, offer similar perspectives and have served to reinforce this teleological outlook, where our knowledge of the enormity of the Shoah shapes how scholars measure the progression of Jewish response. Memoirs especially reinforce this notion. Authors have committed their experiences to the page chiefly because of the scope of the destruction and the loss of their pre-war ways of life. Those memoirs written in the last 20 or 30 years were primarily written by those who were children or in their early teens at the time, and we need to consider that their perspective of events was shaped by the post-war presentation of the Holocaust. The Yiskerbuch genre, often the best source for local histories of destroyed Jewish communities, must also be read carefully. As many scholars using these sources have noted, there is an overwhelming tendency to either romanticize shtetl existence and pre-war life, or to indicate the high levels of anti-Semitism that existed and which should have served as a warning to those Jews living in those locales. This perspective is understandable, as many, if not most, articles were written by Landsleit, members of those communities. Thus, Yiskerbücher still remain the most valuable local histories of Jewish settlement in Eastern Europe, written from the Jewish perspective. It is just incumbent on historians to use these volumes appropriately. Even the diaries of Polish Jews do not offer such perspectives as the ones that I propose for further analysis, nor should we expect these testaments to serve the analytic needs of post-war historians. Diaries serve not only as catalogs of daily events, but also as coping mechanisms. As James Young has written, quote, in fact, for diarists like Chaim Kaplan, Emanuel Ringelblum, Zila Kamenovich, Mary Berg, and so many others, bearing witness was less a literary act and more a biological necessity. For some, it was even a national obligation, end quotes. These primary sources are vital and treasured documents, but represent individuals making sense of their daily experiences as much as they serve as chronicles. Scholars of literature have best been able to demonstrate cyclical and repetitive nature of Jewish response and reaction to crisis in the modern era. Allegorical and symbolic literature and liturgy are often best suited as a means to convey horrors that are impossible to put into words. Indeed, even as many first-person Holocaust memoirs were published out of a need to detail the genocide for subsequent generations, many survivors like Tadeusz Borowski, Kac-Setnik, Heinrich Grünberg, Jerzy Kosinski took to fiction to give voice to their own experiences. Such writing is not without precedent in Jewish history. Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, in particular, has shown how Jews have used liturgical language and biblical narrative to describe medieval persecution in place of historical narrative. David Roski's Against the Apocalypse is successful in following Nathan Wachtel's contention that, quote, every event occurs in a context already there, made up of institutions, customs, practices, meanings, and patterns which both resist and sustain human activity, end quote. Historians of Jewish politics have also succeeded in connecting pre-war activity to wartime response. Daniel Blattman, the authors in the edited volume on Zionist youth movements during the Shoah, and Raya Cohen have all noted continuities in the political activities between the 30s and the early war years. Specifically, these scholars have pointed out how the form and substance of pre-war Jewish parties was crucial in providing guidance in constructing response to ghettoization beginning in 1940. The historiography on political movements connect to the first mode of analysis that I wish to explore. While the scholars I have mentioned all show continuity between the ideology of Bundes, the socialist anti-Zionist Jewish workers movement, Zionists, and even religious Jews in relation to the political activity that followed the Nazi occupation of Poland, no work exists that draws connections between these disparate ideologies. I want to draw out two major issues here. The first being the significance of youth culture in political movements, and the second being the character of leadership and the contentious issue of accommodation with the Nazis. Political and politicized youth movements in particular did not acquiesce to the barbarity that intended to destroy their political will. Historians often characterize the interwar cultural production of committed Zionists or Bundes youth as being aloof from the political mainstream. And indeed, that aloofness was visible even under ghetto conditions. In fact, it was the desire to reshape Jewish society as a whole along utopian ideals that drove their actions and which functioned as an ideological bulwark during the war. Take, for example, the following from the Bundes-produced Jugendstimme from Warsaw in late 1940. Quotes, "It is for us to determine that Poland was not defeated so quickly were it not in great part for the semi-fascist regime, that Sanacja and the Index mentally prepared the masses to accept fascist ideology," end quote. So despite the Nazi occupation, Bundes still carried forward a chip on their shoulder against the semi-authoritarian and frankly rather benign rule of Józef Piłsudski's government following the 1926 coup. Their response to Nazi occupation is shaped by their experiences campaigning for workers' rights within their limited frame of experience. The war for them was, quote, "a holy war for the cause of socialism," end quote. Moreover, their own sacrifices were, in their words, sacrifices in the shadow of those Bundes martyrs like Hersch Leckertz, who had died in the early years of the party's existence. He died in 1902 during a failed attempt to overthrow a Russian official. The underground Bundes press also continued the ambiguous position towards the Soviet Union that existed in the interwar period, blaming capitalism for war without acknowledging the Red Army's occupation of half of Poland. This, of course, was in the case of Warsaw, which was not occupied by the Red Army. Indeed, such political grandstanding was not exclusive to the Bund. As a result of this ideological intransigence, unity among political parties was still out of reach, even in the miserable conditions of the major urban Polish ghettos, as we saw today. Just as with the German, Austrian, and Czech Jews deported east and who refused rapprochement with the Ostjuden, the Eastern European Jews, who had become their new neighbors in the ghettos, politics still prevented cooperation. In the case of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, only when there was full knowledge of Treblinka and the reality of mass murder, as well as support from Polish resistance outside of the ghetto, did opposing militias cooperate. Unlike the issue of youth movements, the actions of the Jewish councils, or the Judenräte, in the Polish ghettos have long been a source of contention among scholars. Many see these bodies as having not just made accommodations with the Nazis, but actively collaborating. I wish to argue that regardless of how we may interpret their actions, the form of the relationship that Jewish leaders had with Nazi functionaries mirrors past interactions with hostile authorities. While the Judenräte have received the most critical attention in Holocaust historiography, there remains the question of how much these councils followed historic patterns of Stadtland, the wheedling and cajoling used by Jewish intercessors with non-Jewish leadership. Isaiah Trunk and others have brought up the parallels between the heads of Jewish councils and local Jewish authorities who procured the cantonists for decades of service in the Tsarist army starting in the 1820s. While similarities do exist between the heads of the Judenräte, like Chaim Rumkowski, who deported children to save the more productive adults, productive, of course, in quotes, the attitudes of Jewish leadership during the Holocaust mirrors the activities by religious and non-Jewish religious leaders during the First World War. These individuals were not faced with systematic murder, but they were faced with the threat of imminent pogroms and widespread epidemic disease that hit poor Jews especially hard. In Galician cities like Lviv, now Lviv in the Ukraine, both 1914 and 1918 brought catastrophic violence, hunger, and political uncertainty. Territory changed hands repeatedly, and Jewish leaders were left to navigate between occupation forces that viewed the Jewish populations as traitorous and as outright spies. Vilna, too, changed hands more than 9 times, forcing Jewish leaders to make accommodations with militaries that often were an outright threat. Finally, I want to briefly discuss the issue of corruption and smuggling during the war. While these topics are often avoided as they're often quite uncomfortable, it is in the realm of criminal behavior, and here I use the term criminal quite loosely as smuggling during the Second World War was necessary to save lives. It was in the realm of criminal behavior where pre-war activities directly shaped wartime practices. One of Polish Jewish history's most colorful, unscrupulous characters was Mordechai Pinkert, known as Motel, the self-proclaimed king of the dead. He was the best known Jewish undertaker in Warsaw from roughly 1924 through 1943, creating the first for-profit Jewish funeral bureau in Poland in 1935. He embezzled funds from the Warsaw Jewish community and swindled grieving families out of money. Yet he was adored by much of Warsaw's poor Jews for his efforts to aid the poor and provide free halachic burials, those according to Jewish religious law. This combination of criminality and populism allowed him to maintain the same business model between 1935 and 1942, and he only managed to add more branches and employees as the level of mortality rose after 1940. But yet he still continued in exactly the same manner that he had before the war. He used his connections both in the Jewish and Polish underworld and in more legitimate spheres to arm ghetto fighters and save members of the Gera Rebbe's family from deportation, all while continuing to amass his personal fortune. None of these actions would have been possible had Pinkert not established his business structure before the war. Like burial, smuggling was a necessary function of ghetto existence. Smugglers provided the vast majority of food to the major ghettos. Yet smuggling was only possible through the combined knowledge of the Jewish underworld that engaged in similar activities before the war. In the Vilna ghetto, for instance, Jews were only allowed to carry 300 Soviet rubles into the ghetto, with gold and other valuables to be surrendered at the ghetto gate. This order was strictly followed by middle-class members of Jewish society and professionals who were fearful of Nazi reprisal. Whereas others smuggled valuables in the lining of their clothes, quote, "These intrepid people," Isaiah Trunk has written, "were mostly the teamsters, coachmen, porters, black market dealers, and underworld operators. It was from this segment of the Jewish population that the smugglers mainly emerged. Those people were already familiar with hard conditions of life before the war," end quotes. Like Pinkert, these individuals came into the ghetto with pre-existing knowledge of how to make their situation better in difficult conditions. Their ability to procure goods was due in part to the fact that Jews and non-Jews most closely associated in the underworld before the start of the Second World War. Non-Jews on the so-called Aryan side were necessary partners, and it was these pre-war connections that allowed for the procurement of goods. So to conclude, I want to begin with a quote. "Write, record, and collect." These words are quite familiar, but these were not spoken by Shimon Dubnov, but by Yehuda Leib Peretz, Yankiv Dinizin, and Shin Ansky in a public call to the Jews of the Russian Empire in late 1914. They understood, as Dubnov did almost 3 decades later, that they stood at a historic precipice that threatened the Jewish future and hoped to induce Jews to take up modern forms of historical documentation. This parallel is merely another indication of how we may understand the phenomenological perspective of Jewish victims of Nazi genocide. Their responses and comprehension of events were constructed out of both individual and collective realms of experience. This paper was, of course, just an initial cursory attempt to identify a means of analysis that may better help reconcile the Jewish past with Nazi efforts at destruction. Even the most contentious elements of Jewish behavior during the Holocaust found form in the lived pre-war experiences of the victims of the Holocaust. It is crucial for scholars to better characterize these connections, to add dimensions to the lives of the victims of Nazi genocide, who too often are relegated to places of prominence only in narratives of victimhood. Just to conclude, again, this was just an initial take, but it's more of my desire here just to encourage scholars to engage in more of these connecting activities to link pre-war life to the Holocaust. Too often, victims are just made out to be solely victims, and we lose their sense of self that existed before the war. And I think this provides a much more complete picture of these individuals as human beings, and we can understand, how they contend with the realities of destruction, and then how they contend with their lives after the war for those who survive. And it also gives a voice to those who don't survive. Often the narrative of Holocaust victims is given to us by people who do survive. So I think this is a way of sort of reconciling some of these past means of Holocaust narrative. So thank you very much.